Let's have a look at venous hemodynamics. So the effects of exercise on the circulatory system. How does it affect the arteries and veins? As we exercise, our tissues or muscles have a higher metabolic demand. Arterioles start to dilate. When a vessel gets larger, we know that resistance decreases. So it helps to increase the blood volume that's being provided to the muscle to provide more oxygen and nutrients to meet those metabolic demands. So we know that if there's more in on the arterial side, there's more out on the venous side. And a pressure gradient exists across all capillary beds. Higher on the arterial side, lower on the venous side, and blood moves from high to low pressure. Transmural pressure is the difference between the venous and tissue pressure. Transmural just means across the wall. If we have high transmural pressure, the venous pressure is higher than the tissue pressure, and we have a distended looking vein or round. When we have low transmural pressure, the venous pressure within the vein is lower than that of the tissue. This causes that dumbbell shape because the tissue can actually collapse the vein. Veins are collapsible, they're low pressure, and they have the ability to receive large volumes of blood with minimal pressure changes. So they have a high capacitance to maintain and hold a lot of blood volume. Venous return relies on pressure gradients, our respirations, and the influence of cardiac activity, and the muscular pump or that gastrocnemius contraction, our calf muscle, squeezing to help propel the blood back up to the right atrium. Hydrostatic pressure. It's a form of potential energy caused by the weight of a fluid as measured compared to a reference point. So the reference point in the human body is the right atrium. All blood is moving back to the right atrium, and the right atrium has the lowest pressure, 2 to 5 millimeters of mercury. So lowest pressure in our body is at the right atrium within our circulatory system. Hydrostatic pressure is defined as the density of blood times gravitational acceleration times the height of the column of blood. The height of the column of blood is what we're concerned about. So if we look up in the corner here, this little fellow, he's going to have less hydrostatic pressure. So his blood or venous blood has less distance to travel back to his heart than somebody that's actually taller. So there's a greater distance between the ankle and right atrium on somebody that's actually taller. Imagine a diver as they dive deeper, the water above them or that weight of the fluid is getting heavier and pushing that diver deeper into the water. So that hydrostatic pressure is increasing. So hydrostatic pressure is the force that the venous return has to overcome to get back to that right atrium. Hydrostatic pressure is negligible when we're lying down because now that weight of the column has been removed. So if we actually put our feet higher than our heart, then there's no hydrostatic pressure. It's actually gravitational pull is helping to return the venous blood from our legs. So hydrostatic pressure is really that force that the venous blood has to work against to get back up to the heart. When we're standing for long periods of time, our pressure at our ankle level is about 80 millimeters of mercury. That's distal venous pressure. That's because that hydrostatic pressure is causing that dilation of the vein. Transmural pressure increases, so we get a distended looking vein. Pressure within the vein is higher than the tissue. Transmural pressure rises, which means that capillary fusion decreases. The pressure gradient is not maintained from the arterial to the venous side. Venous return decreases. And if there's less venous return back to the heart, cardiac output decreases. The muscular pump and venous valves help to reduce hydrostatic pressure and prevent retrograde flow or backflow away from the heart. They also ensure the efficiency of the muscular pump. So the further we are away from the heart, the more venous valves we'll have, and the most being in our distal lower extremities. So here we have the squeeze of blood, and this valve is closed. This contraction of our calf muscle propels the blood up to the heart and to the next valve. In relaxation of that muscle, this valve closes, preventing backflow. And then with the squeeze again, the next valve opens and it propels it back up to the heart. So those valves essentially are reducing the hydrostatic pressure by reducing the height of the blood column. All right, it's all a delicate balance. So let's just look very simplistically at a capillary bed and capillary. So an arterial, venule, and just literally very simplistic terms here. So on the arterial side, we have two things happening. We have blood cells moving across from the arterial to the venous side across this capillary here. We have fluid leak out into the interstitial space. It's higher pressure on the arterial side, so we get this fluid out into the interstitial space, and then we get reabsorption on the venous side. And this is basically based on that pressure gradient from high to low. So when the venous side is a normal pressure, the pressure gradient is maintained. Oh my goodness. Let's go back here. Sorry about that. Is maintained. So capillary perfusion continues on as normal. What happens if we have an increase on the venous pressure side of that capillary bed? We have fluid leak out into the interstitial space, but with that rising venous pressure, the reabsorption of that fluid can't happen. Then what happens is we have an increased buildup of fluid in that interstitial space. That's when we start to look puffy and we get a fluid accumulation out into our interstitial spaces or tissues. So we have a decrease of reabsorption of fluid back into the venous side of the capillary bed. And we also have a reduction of capillary fusion, or a slowing of that blood moving from the arterial to venous side, because it's now has a decreased pressure gradient. So the arterial side, the higher pressure arterial side, is starting to equalize because the venous pressure is rising. So capillary perfusion decreases. So we have a decrease of absorption of the fluid, decreased capillary perfusion, which in turn reduces venous return. Less venous blood getting back to the heart means that there's less cardiac output. So that pressure gradient is lost. Okay, let's look at respiration and how it affects venous return. If you take a deep breath in, you're actually filling up your chest cavity or your lungs with air, and your diaphragm is being pulled down. The thoracic cavity is increasing in size. When we have an increase in size in that thoracic cavity, we actually have a pressure drop. Venous return to the heart increases. As we have that diaphragm being pulled down, take a deep breath in. Our diaphragm is being pulled down as our lungs fill with oxygen, and our abdominal cavity is actually getting smaller, and that smaller cavity has a higher pressure. So now what happens? venous return in our lower extremities starts to slow because it's working against that high abdominal pressure. So we have hydrostatic pressure to work against, and then also by taking that deep breath in, or just even a regular breath, just our regular respirations, that abdominal pressure increases, which slows or seizes lower extremity venous return. If you exhale, we're actually blowing all that oxygen out of our lungs. The thoracic cavity is getting smaller, and this increases the pressure. Venous return to the heart decreases, but what happens is that our abdominal cavity is now larger and pressure is reduced. So flow in the lower extremities actually starts to increase. And this is what it looks like when we see a spectral tracing. We have this reflection of pressure. So inspiration, we have an increased abdominal pressure. So venous return slows. This is inspiration. As we exhale, abdominal pressure decreases and we have more venous return. More blood returning. This is exhalation. And so it goes, inspiration and expiration. And we can see that undulation in the venous return. Let's have a look at cardiac influence. So the closer we are to the heart, the more cardiac influence we're going to see in that venous return. So we have pressure changes happening in that right atrium that are reflected in the venous system because all venous blood is going back to that right atrium. So what's affecting the right atrium is actually, we can see it in our venous system and our spectral tracings. So if we think about systole, the right ventricle is squeezing. So that right atrium has actually just emptied. So the pressure starts out low and slowly rises. Diastole, the tricuspid valve opens wide, so blood is moving right through that right atrium into the right ventricle to refill that ventricle again until systole happens. So during diastole, right atrium is emptying and the pressure is extremely low. The gateways are open. So blood is continually filling into that right atrium. So we have this forward motion of blood during systole and diastole. So what happens is diastole, it's slowly, let's look at slowly rising, and then what happens is there's an atrial kick or right atrial contraction, that last squeeze of the muscle trying to squeeze the last bit of blood into that right ventricle. So during right atrial contraction, there's a spike in that pressure, and we can see that reflected in our spectral tracings. So we get this backflow of blood, and blood is unable to return to the heart because of that increase in pressure into the right atrium. So now what happens is the ventricle has filled. The ventricle now squeezes the blood out, and this all starts again. And this is reflected in our spectral tracings. This is seen at the common femoral vein. So we have this systole, we have this filling of blood into the right atrium, essentially, is what's happening. So this is to the heart. Then we have diastole, and then we have this little spike in pressure, atrial kick. And this is actually moving away from the heart. So that's the only time that blood is moving away from the heart when we consider normal cardiac function. And again, we continue to see that. Systole, diastole, atrial kick. Systole, diastole, atrial kick. And this is reflected in other veins in our system as well. So hopefully this enlightens you a little bit onto the hemodynamics and clears up any muddy points.